Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So while I have my shame on you sign up, and let me make sure I'm up. I'm seeing green. And I am seeing myself moving, I think. Okay. I'm assuming that that's going to come up, and let me check my volume once before we go. So while I have my shame on you sign up, I feel I need to jump across the pond and talk about the NHS. So there was somebody who in one of my messages, in one of the comments, had made this point of saying, it's like, wow, he was like, I live here and I support Jeremy Corbyn, but you seem to be way over the top. My support, and if I see him over the top on some of this stuff, is because you guys have certain advantages that we ourselves don't have in this country. I just did a story where one of the hospitals kicked the person out the hospital because the person couldn't afford to pay. Threw her in freezing temperatures because the person couldn't afford to pay their bill. There is no situation in the NHS where that would happen. You guys may have situations where you may have longer waiting lists and everything else. Fair enough. But the people get seen. And if I'm not mistaken, you guys have the #1 healthcare system in the world. Now, the point I made yesterday I think it was yesterday, talking about Prime Minister questions, was that whether it's the #1 healthcare system in the world is kind of besides the point. The point of the healthcare system is not to be #1 in the world. The point of the healthcare system is to provide healthcare. We need to make sure that the people of Britain are taken care of. That's the point of healthcare. If you guys are having problems, and if you guys are having a situation where the resources are not getting to people who need it, or it's not adequate, meaning you're not necessarily meeting the demand, it means you need more resources added to that particular healthcare system to make that healthcare system do what it's supposed to do. This story came out in The Guardian today, and this is damning, because the conversation that Theresa May had yesterday that was aggravating the shit out of me was, well, we're putting X amount of dollars into the NHS. In fact, I'm going to show her argument, her conversation. But I kept making the point that regardless of how much you're putting into the system itself, if you're not putting in enough to allow it to function at its optimal level, then what you're putting is not enough for it to function at its optimal level. If I need to put in $10, but I only have 5, it's nice that you put in 5, but it needs 10 to ride. Let's take a look at this. This is The Guardian. NHS patients dying in hospital quarters. A&E doctors tell Theresa May. So when Jeremy Corbyn said it, that was one thing. Now the doctors themselves are saying, our patients are dying in quarters under your leadership. Doctors running 68 A&E departments tell Prime Minister patients are dying prematurely because staff are too busy to treat them. Now, understand, the staff is not busy to treat them because the staff is sticking around. The staff is not too busy to treat them because they're out drinking tea somewhere. They don't have the resources that they need. They don't have enough personnel. They don't have enough people. Theresa May and her government has been making certain cuts, or at the very least not funding to the level that those departments need to be funded. Jeremy Corbyn brought this up in Prime Minister Questions, and he went at her on this in Prime Minister Questions, and Jeremy Corbyn was right. You're not funding it adequately. Now the doctors themselves are bringing it home to brass tacks. Patients are dying. Your policies are killing patients. Patients are dying. Let's read the story. Patients are dying in hospital quarters during the ongoing winter crisis because the NHS is too underfunded and short-staffed that it cannot cope, senior doctors have warned Theresa May. A&E units are under such intense strain that patients are in intolerable risk of being harmed by receiving poor care. Specialists in emergency medicine from 69 hospitals have told the Prime Minister in a letter of unprecedented alarm. In recent weeks, some hospitals have become so overloaded that they have been looking after as many as 120 patients a day in quarters, some dying prematurely as a result, the letter says. The doctors, consultants who work and run A&E hospitals or units in England and Wales have written to May to highlight the very serious concerns we have for the safety of our patients. The current level of safety compromise is at times intolerable, despite the best efforts of our staff. If you remember, Theresa May was like, well, the staff does an amazing job. The staff does an amazing job. And you're trying to down our staff. You're dogging our staff, man. You're dogging our hospitals. And Jeremy Corbyn is like, all of us support the hospitals. All of us support the staff in those hospitals. What we're saying as labor, as new labor, not the Blairites, what we're saying as labor is that you need to fund those hospitals to the level that they need to be funded to make sure you don't have people dying in the goddamn corridors. Let's keep going. Conditions at many A&E units are so appalling that they could kill patients, claim the signatories, who work at both major teaching hospitals and smaller district general hospitals. They include Frimley Health Trust in Surrey, which May visited last week in an attempt to reassure the public that the NHS was coping well with the winter. As you would know, a number of scientific publications have shown that the crowded emergency departments are dangerous for patients. The longer the patients stay in the emergency departments after the treatment has completed, the greater is their morbidity and associated morbidity, they write. The intervention came as new NHS figures showed that the percentage of patients being treated within 4 hours at hospital-based A&E units in England fell last month to its lowest ever level at negative 77%. Let me repeat that. Their intervention came as new NHS figures showed that the percentage of patients being treated within 4 hours at hospital-based A&E units in England fell last month to its lowest ever, negative 70.3%. The performance of all types of settings offering A&E type care taken together, including walk-in centers and urgent care centers, was better, but still joint worst ever at 85%. Negative, I guess I'm trying to say negative 85%, far below the politically important targets of 95%. Oh, I see. Their worst ever 85%, far below the politically important targets of 95%. Essentially, they're not making their targets. They're not making their targets. Only 3 of the NHS's 137 acute trusts hit the 95% target, while 32 were at or below 70%. Blackpool Teaching Trust had by far the lowest performance at 40%. Jesus Christ. The figures reinforced the warnings to ministers on Thursday from NHS providers that it would be impossible to deliver on their pledge that all hospitals would be achieving 95% by March. Our emergency departments are not just under pressure, but in a state of emergency. Dr. Taj Hassan, the president of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, which represents A&E doctors. The NHS undertook unprecedented planning to help services cope with the annual spike in demand in December and January. Despite the hospitals had a record number of emergency admissions last month, 520,163, a 4.5% rise in the number admitted in December 2016. Look, at the end of the day, what this boils down to is these doctors are pleading with Theresa May, pleading with the Tory government that they don't have the resources that they need to make sure that there's adequate care in Britain and that patients will be dying in quarters based on Theresa May, her government, not supplying and funding those things to the degree that they need to be funded. You don't go to right-wingers for issues of healthcare. I don't care if that's in Britain. I don't care if that's in America. Right-wingers have other priorities. The healthcare is not their priority. And let's hear Theresa May. She answers or gives her response, not to this particular article or this letter, but she gives a response to Jeremy Corbyn, who brings up these issues. Let's hear her comments. Now, compare her comments to what I just read. Patients dying in corridors. Patients being treated literally outside because they don't have the beds and they don't have the space and they don't have the doctors in order to treat those patients. She's underfunded the NHS. Let's take a look at her comments and her response to this.
Just to, Mr. Speaker, I know it seems a long time ago, but just before Christmas, I asked the Prime Minister about the 12,000 people left waiting more than half an hour in the back of an ambulance at A&E departments. She told the House the NHS was better prepared for winter than ever before. So what words of comfort does the Prime Minister have to the 17,000 patients waiting in the back of ambulances in the last week of December? Is it that nothing is perfect by any chance?
I fully accept that the NHS is under pressure over winter. It is regularly under pressure at winter times. I've been very clear. I apologise to those people who've had their operations delayed and to those people who have had their admissions to hospital delayed. But it is indeed the case that the NHS was better prepared this winter than ever before. And it might be helpful. Yes. It might be helpful if I let the House know some of the things that were done in order to ensure that preparedness. More people than ever before having flu vaccines, 2,700 more acute beds being made available since November. For the first time ever, we have seen urgent GP appointments available across the Christmas period across this country. More doctors specialising in treating the elderly in accident and emergency. But the Right Honourable Gentleman mentions the last exchange that we had in this House. In our last exchange, he said mental health budgets have been cut. That is not right. Simon Stevens from the National Health Service has made clear that mental health spending has gone up both in real terms and as a proportion of the overall spending. So will he now apologise for what he previously said?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows full well that CAM's budgets have been raided and that many people that need help are not getting that help. And Mr. Speaker, we saw on ITV News the other night that nurses are spending their entire shift treating people in car parks because of backed-up ambulances. We know the Prime Minister recognises there's a crisis in our NHS because she wanted to sack the Health Secretary last week, but was too weak to do it. And if the NHS is so well-resourced and so well-prepared, why was a decision taken last week to cancel the operations of 55,000 patients during the month of January?
I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, well, from the front bench, the Labour Party say apologise. Actually, if he had listened to the answer that I gave to his right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, I made clear that I have already apologised to those whose operations have been delayed, and we will make sure that those operations are reinstated as soon as possible. We are putting record funding into the NHS and record funding into mental health. But he keeps on about the preparations for the National Health Service. I was very pleased last week to be able to go and say in person a thank you to staff at Frimley Health Trust from both Frimley Park and Wexham Park hospitals for the work that they have been doing to deliver for patients across this period of particular pressure across the winter. Our NHS staff, and that's not just doctors and nurses, it's support staff like radiographers, it's administrative staff, it's porters, it's everybody working in our National Health Service, do a fantastic job day in and day out, and they particularly do that when we see these winter pressures. But in terms of being prepared, this is what NHS providers said only last week. Preparations for winter in the NHS have been more extensive and meticulous than ever before.
Well, today those people are saying that they have patients dying in the hallways because you haven't funded them in the way they need to be funded. And just because they're saying that their preparations are meticulous doesn't mean that they're being funded in the way they need to be funded. Yes, with the meager items and resources that you gave us in order to do this, meaning with the insufficient resources that you gave us, yes, we've meticulously worked to make sure that we're ready, to the degree that we can be ready. 17,000 people outside of hospital carts, meaning being treated by nurses outside. 55,000 delayed operations. that's going onto a list of already 4 million operations. You have money from the government being siphoned into private enterprise. So even though she's saying we're giving all of this money to our healthcare system, then the question becomes, well, why is the money that you're giving not adequate? Where is this money being siphoned off to? And is it possible that because you've been chopping off sections of the NHS in order to give it over to private enterprise, that private enterprise does what private enterprise does? It maximizes the profit, and in this case, at the expense of the British taxpayers. Meaning, instead of that money going into the healthcare system itself in order to provide care, it's actually going into somebody else's pocket. Let her finish. I'm not going to interrupt this one because I did this the other day, but they're making a charge that people are dying in the hallways because Theresa May's government hasn't funded NHS to the degree that it needs to be funded in order to operate during this winter season. These arguments ring hollow to me. That's all. Let's keep going.
Mr. Speaker, we all thank all NHS staff for what they do, but the reality is that the 55,000 operations cancelled means that those 55,000 people join the already 4 million waiting for operations within the NHS. Perhaps the Prime Minister could listen to the experience of Vicky. Her 82-year-old mother spent 13 hours on a trolley in a corridor. That was on top of the 3 hours between her first calling 999 and arriving at hospital. Vicky says, and I quote, "A volunteer first responder from Warwickshire Heart Service, whose day job is in the army, kept Mum safe until paramedics arrived. Her mother then suffered a heart attack just a week before. This is not an isolated case." Does the Prime Minister really believe the NHS is better prepared than ever for the crisis it's now going through?
First of all, can I say to the right honourable gentleman that nobody wants to hear people having to experience what Vicky and her mother had experienced. And of course,
That's kind of his point. That's kind of his point. That's why he's bringing it up. Because nobody wants to hear it. Not just nobody wants to hear it, nobody wants to live it. Nobody wants to live it. That's a real world scenario. Imagine if that was your mom, your aunt, your uncle, your dad, had just had a heart attack a week ago, needs to go in for an emergency and spends 13 hours waiting in a corridor because the Tory government didn't believe that it was necessary or found that there were other priorities as opposed to putting resources into the NHS. Or they thought market-based solution was a little bit better idea, meaning they were going to chop off parts of the NHS and give it to private interests. Whatever. In either case, whether you like to hear it or not, ultimately, your policy decisions, your rules, the things that you and your party has been doing has allowed that case that nobody wants to hear that, has allowed that particular case to take place. He's not saying it because you want to hear it. He's saying it because you don't want to hear it. He's saying it because nobody wants to hear it, let alone live it. Fund your NHS to the degree that it needs to be funded. And maybe instead of doing tax cuts, you look out for the rest of the Brits. Let's keep going. Let's hear your answer.
Of course, we need to ensure that we learn from these incidents, and that's exactly what we do in the National Health Service. And I'm very happy to ensure that that particular case is looked at, if he would like to provide me with the details of that particular case. But week in and week out in the run-up to Christmas, and now today, what the right honourable gentleman is doing is giving an impression of a National Health Service that is failing everybody that goes to use the NHS. The reality in our NHS is that we are seeing 2.9 million more people now going to accident and emergency. We're seeing over 2 million more operations taking place each year. Our National Health Service is something that we should be proud of. And that's why it's a first-class National Health Service, a first-class National Health Service that has been identified as the #1 health system in the world. That means it's a better health system than Australia, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Canada, Switzerland, Sweden, France, Germany, and the United States of America.
Mr. Speaker, we're all on this side of the House very proud of the principle of the National Health Service, healthcare as a human right. But the reality is that in the past year, 565,000 people have spent time on trolleys when they should be treated. The number of elderly people being rushed into A&E from care homes has risen by 62% since the Tories took power. Care Quality Commission figures suggest that nearly a quarter of homes need improvement. Not only is this robbing older people of their dignity, but it's putting pressure on A&Es and on ambulance services. So why, instead of dealing with the social care crisis, has the Prime Minister rewarded the Health Secretary with a promotion and a new job title?
I think Theresa May made her point. I just think the point doesn't fly. That's all. They're telling you that there are particular problems in the NHS. Nobody is saying that the NHS is a horrible, horrible thing. They're making a point that there are real-life calamity and real-life bad situations that's taken place because of the cuts and the decisions that you've made in your NHS. Whatever you want to say in your Prime Minister questions, the bare bones of it is you've presided over a government that has allowed this to take place. This is a record of failure. I mean, come on. You have patients dying in the goddamn corridors. You have doctors that are a part of your national healthcare system pleading and begging with you, sending out this emergency flare for assistance because they're terrified that the lack of resources, not funding them to the degree that needs to be funded, because as Tories, you don't necessarily believe that that's, or at the very least you believe other things are more important than making sure people have health care. They're ill-equipped. They're inadequately funded. These guys are pleading with you for resources. And you're standing at the dispatch box acting like this is Candyland and ponies. It's like, come on. I wish this article came out a few days beforehand. What day did this come out? Because I wish she was confronted with this in Prime Minister question. I mean, to some degree, Jeremy Corbyn did mention this, but this is more stark. I mean, this is literally doctors pleading with the Prime Minister. We need resources. We need funding. Otherwise, people are going to be dying in the corridors. 55,000 delayed operations. 17,000 people waiting in the corridors. That doesn't count the number of people who are waiting outside, where nurses are treating them outside because they don't have the staff and resources and emergency room doctors in order to see those people. That is abysmal. That is a record of failure. It's an amazing record of failure. I'm not going to belabor the point. It's just protect your NHS. That's all I'm saying. I just did a story, I'm going to repeat this, of them kicking a woman out of the hospital. The woman goes to the hospital to get care because that woman doesn't have cash. She doesn't have insurance. She doesn't have some mechanism to which to pay for this hospital. This hospital, whose CEO is handsomely paid, kicks this woman out into the freezing cold. Protect your NHS. That's my point. That's my point. The Tories would destroy your social safety net. It would rip your NHS apart if you gave it the opportunity. And the further to the right that you slide, the more they're going to eat that NHS alive until they get to the point where they can destroy it completely and privatize it. And what will happen, I guarantee you, is as you go down in the future, it will get normalized. So the fact that those people don't have access to health care will become a normal thing. And the argument that Tories would take, well, at that point would be, we need to privatize more. We need to make this a little bit more difficult. We need to get more cash into the hands of these people, meaning more of a burden on the citizens in the UK. I am telling you, the slide took place in the United States. The slide will take place in the UK also if you allow the Tories to take this much. It may not seem much in the beginning, but year after year after year, it will be one thing after the next after the next. If they have a willing minority party, meaning a weak, feckless minority party that for the most part would enshrine the gains of the Tories instead of trying to make gains for themselves, you will find that your country will slide further and further to the right. One of the battle lines is the NHS. Protect your NHS. That is my advice to the darker brother across from the pond. So, let's see who's here. Dan Howell. I don't have the British parties, but in America, it's both Republicans and Democrats are doing this. Yeah, in America, it's both. Over there, they have Labor, and Jeremy Corbyn is not hearing of them destroying NHS, which is why he's bringing this up so emphatically. I love it. Let's see, Dan Howell. Very much. Labor is more left, and I think your Democrats are more like Tories. Yeah, that's true. Your parties seem to swing the same way. Yeah, they do. They do. That's true. Tories are meant to be pro-private business, liberal unionists in regards to the disparate kingdoms of the UK. The Eurosceptic friendly. Oh, I see. Labour is meant to be the opposition. Well, in this case, yeah, Labour is opposition. But Labour doesn't necessarily have something that translates in the United States. Maybe Bernie Sanders, but to the left of Sanders. I mean, ultimately, the Democrats in this country are like the Tories, which is why I have somewhat of an understanding of the Tories and what they would do. They would move further and further to the right. There is nothing like the Republican Party, at least not in the UK. Like, you're talking about a party that's closer to fundamentalists in Iraq than you're talking about an actual party system. These guys are... But, by the way, it is the Democrats that allow them to move that far to the right. Whatever your opposition party is, if your opposition party becomes somewhat of a corporatist neo-lib thing, the right will move further to the right. They're not going to shake hands and agree. They're going to move further to the right. The gains that they make is going to be more things where they're going to eat and privatize more items in your country. Protect your NHS. Tay-Ray88. Scotland is pro-EU, which didn't want Brexit. Yeah, that is slightly weird. Slightly weird and slightly funny. So, watching Prime Minister Questions, you see the cat from Scotland, and the guy, not the new one, and he would continuously ask about Brexit, and he would get pissed over and over and over when he's talking about Brexit, because he's like, it's very clear that he didn't want to go. Scotland didn't want to go. He was representing the interests of Scotland, who did not want to go, and it's strange. So Scotland holds a referendum. In that referendum, the UK says, yes, you need to stay. We need to stay together. We need to stay together. Come on, we're closer. You know, we're better together than apart, etc., etc. And then we have the referendum for the UK and Brexit. And Britain decides to leave. And essentially taking Scotland with it. Now, Scotland, I understand Scotland wants to stay in the EU. But does Scotland really want to be under the level of austerity as Greece and some of these other countries losing access to their own currency? I mean, I understand they want to stay, but there are disadvantages in the stay. I don't live there, so fair enough. I'm just saying. Dan Howell, privatization just means handing over government privileges to a private corporation. It is not the same as opening up services to private competition. That's true. That's true. They don't always have open bid contracts. Some of those things are just kind of crony capitalism where you allow somebody to take over a particular business. Not to mention, somebody is going to be making massive amounts of profit. The money that would have went into the service itself is now going into somebody else's pocket. Somebody else is maximizing the profit. Which means if you're going to provide the same service, you're either paying that company more to do the same thing, or you're getting less service, or you're paying the worker less. Which means that the person would have made more money working with all of that money going into the government actually doing that particular activity as opposed to going into private corporations. It's like a charter school. You're paying for a service where you're not getting better service at all. And ultimately, you're just doing it just purely for the sake of privatization. There's no benefit. There's no plus in it. These guys have this ideological bend that's going to make somebody else massive amounts of cash, and they find this way where they want to chop into these areas of government. No, you're not going to get better care. Yes, it's going to be more expensive. And yes, the staff is going to get paid less. All of those things are negatives. Protect your NHS. This is friendly advice. We don't have private health care. We have a mixture of private and public, which entails the worst of both. Rebel Cage Rattler. Wow, they get down and serious in their hearings. Yeah, they do, Rebel. Yeah, I love that. I love British Parliament. Australian Parliament also. I don't know as much about Australian politics, but yeah, Australian Parliament is also funny. Dan Howell, approval voting is better than ranked choice. Australia has ranked choice and still has an entrenched two-party system. Blah, blah. Rachel M., I know, but hear the other side, know the other side. Will not excuse violence, should not be willing to hear people out, though. Should be willing to hear people out, though. Dan Howell, yes, I do feel Bernie could be what Labor is. Bernie's a classic Democrat. I mean, if you look at like FDR, Bernie Sanders is essentially a classic Democrat. He calls himself a socialist. But unless Bernie Sanders is willing to nationalize railroads and nationalize the energy companies, you know, some other socialists are going to be looking at him some kind of way. He comes across as a Democrat. That's all. I mean, don't get me wrong. He has a certain degree of integrity and stands by a certain degree of values. Meaning he's a real thing. He's a true believer in this. I don't know if how far Sanders is to the left, is somewhat constrained by the political apparatus that he's in which case he limits where he would typically go or what he would say he would typically go. But he looks like FDR to me. He looks like FDR to me. He's not as far as Corbyn. I mean, keep in mind, Corbyn is talking about getting rid of the nuclear deterrent. Like, he's talking about getting rid of nuclear weapons. It's like, people are like, what? I don't even agree with Corbyn on that one. Like, I am not that much of a peacenik. I don't have this belief of, I believe those things are made in agreement where everybody steps down, not just unilaterally stepping down yourself, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that might be a little much. We Americans are proud that we are worse than anywhere else in this regard. You mean for healthcare? Yeah, it's always weird. It's weird to hear them brag about healthcare in the United States. They just kicked a fucking person out the healthcare. I mean, off the hospital. And mind you, that's not isolated to Baltimore. That's not isolated to Baltimore. Bernie would have been better, but even Bernie still participates in chroming capitalism, making sure military contractors perform in Vermont. Bernie Sanders is still a politician. Yes. He's still a politician. Not to defend our shitty politics, but it's not that there isn't political space here. It's more of a lack of social awareness. It's a little bit of both. Let's be honest. It's a little bit of both. Like, you've gotten a little bit more political space in Sanders in that race. But if you remember, before Sanders' race, what about the public option? Couldn't even bring it up. Couldn't even bring it up. The best that you could get from a Democratic president was a right-wing healthcare plan. You couldn't even bring up the public option. Obama said he was going to bring up the public option. Wouldn't even bring it up. Wouldn't even touch it. Wouldn't even touch it. That political space has been afforded to you based upon the last election, based on Sanders, and based on progressives essentially being pissed off that they cheated the guy. Your space has essentially been ripped. You know, this new space has been ripped open in political process. Lorms, we just keep repeating, we're the best, we're the best, we're the best. Yeah. Blah, blah, what? Yeah, watch. Yes, Minister. And yes, Prime Minister, JT, you dig it. Yeah. Yeah. House Cards is amazing. What is it called? Watch. Yes, Minister. And yes, Prime Minister, JT. I don't know what that is. That's a show? Blah, blah, that's a show. Yes, Prime Minister. To be the Enriquez. Someone told me Alabama is passing legislation to make work requirement for Medicaid. Some of those places were doing that, which is kind of amazing. I mean, Medicaid, yeah, that's fucking amazing that they're doing that. So let's say you were a kid, you had kidney failure. You get Medicare just by virtue of having kidney failure. And if you're not working, you would get Medicaid. Some of those people are too ill to work. Are they going to make a requirement that forces people who are ill and maybe even too ill to work in order to get access to health care? As if them getting access to health care in any way is somehow affecting their capacity to work. This is fucking amazing that they're tying these two things together. It really is. The original House of Cards, which is British, is too good for words. Oh, wow. Okay. Yes, Minister is supposed to be good. All right, I'll check it out. Yes, Minister. Yeah, I check it out. Alright guys, I'm not going to tarry too much today. Yeah, but I must away. Pleasure as always. Yeah, I'm gonna end this one a little bit early. I did one prior. Um, guys, thank you for showing up. If you enjoy the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the Patreon. Thanks, everyone.